Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. This is part 7 of my Petscop Investigation. In previous installments, I covered videos 1 through 6. In this video, I will be going over Petscop 17 through 24. This has been a long time coming, and I'm pleased to say that the next part of the investigation series is underway as well. In the next installment, I'll be doing an in-depth analysis of the entire series thus far. And let me tell you folks, I've really got my work cut out for me this time around. Before I get started, I'd just like to mention that I recently started a Patreon. So if you value my work, you can support me for as little as $1 a month on patreon.com/nightmaremasterclass. That's patreon.com/nightmaremasterclass. I have various tiers, so check it out and see what works for you. All patrons get their name in the credits of my videos, as well as early access to my podcast, Nightmare Tonight. I've got a humdinger coming out soon. Of course, if you can't afford to become a patron at this time, that's totally okay. There are other ways to help me out. Primarily, you can like my videos, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and you can share my videos with anyone you think might be interested. Be sure to click the notification bell if you'd like to be informed as soon as I release a new video. Oh, and if you're in the mood for something a bit lighter, I would like to recommend another one of my inane projects, The Rudd Files. As the name suggests, The Rudd Files is a podcast dedicated to the work of the insatiable Paul Rudd. Disclaimer: The Rudd Files has not been endorsed by Paul Rudd, nor is he aware of our existence. Please be aware that parasocial relationships are deeply unhealthy, as are obsessive and fantastical ideations regarding the inner worlds of any given celebrity. Anyway, there are 3 episodes out presently, so now's the time to binge. I'll have a link in the video description. Okay, no more shameless self-promotion, I promise. However, I would like to give a quick shout out to the Petscop subreddit, as well as the creators of the Comprehensive Progress Document, a Google Doc created to help keep track of the events in the Petscop series. Seriously, it's an invaluable source of information, and it's surprised my analysis countless times, so check it out if you want to dig a little deeper. I want to emphasize that my investigation series is not a substitute for watching Petscop itself. If you haven't already done so, please watch the latest videos, and I generally encourage you to watch my previous videos, part 1 through 6, prior to watching this one. Let's briefly go over some recent findings. The first thing I'd like to note is that a batch of videos was made available to the general public on April 21st, 2019, Easter Sunday. Specifically, I'm talking about videos 17 through 21. Easter seems to be a significant holiday in the fictional universe of Petscop. I say this for a number of reasons, some of which will be readily apparent when we go over these recent updates. Additionally, there have been several changes to the Petscop YouTube channel's description since my last investigation video. In January of this year, the channel's About section was updated. Some select Petscop recordings. In a way, recordings have the power to raise the dead. They're kind of scary. Currently hunting for hidden content. Towards the beginning of April, the Petscop YouTube channel's icon changed to an Easter egg. The channel's About section was updated as well. Specifically, the last line was changed to the following: "We finished our long Easter egg hunt." Each of the videos that were uploaded on Easter contained the same exact description. After this batch of videos was published, the channel's icon changed back to the image of what we'll now refer to as the Guardian, for reasons that will soon be made clear. In early September, the channel description was amended to include the following line: "Thank you for watching." And then there's a little smiley face there next to it. This coincided with the release of videos 22 through 24. Now, I'd just like to talk about my critical approach for a moment. I know I've said this before, but it's worth emphasizing. I believe that by paying extremely close attention to a work like Petscop, we can come to some conclusions regarding the structure as well as the thematic nature of the work. I think of my approach as something akin to a close reading. basically a shot-by-shot analysis of the work. When you hear this noise, along with the word footnote, that means I'm taking a moment to highlight something I think is noteworthy. As always, if you have any general feedback or if you'd like to point out something I said that you think is highly off base, please leave a comment. I generally try to read every comment, and I make an effort to respond to good faith criticism as time permits. The key word there is good faith. Now, we have quite a bit to go over, so let's get started. Petscop 17 is 13 minutes and 1 second long. It was uploaded on April 20th, 2019, 420. We find the player in a darkened area. It's not entirely clear who is playing. Ominous music plays in the background. The player hits pause and we get a quick look at the pause menu. A message in the upper right-hand corner reads, "The ghost room is a ship in a bottle." Footnote. Recall that the phrase ghost room appeared previously in Petscop 16. It was used in reference to this image, what appears to me to be a diagram of a room. In addition, the term ghost room would seem to be synonymous with testing room. So the pause menu in this here video says, "The ghost room is a ship in a bottle." I take this to mean that the diagram referred to as the ghost room is something that has been constructed in a manner similar to a ship in a bottle. Hobbyists construct miniature ships of this nature in a very careful and methodical fashion, and they usually base their models off of real-world ships. So it stands to reason that the so-called ghost room is based on a real room in the fictional world of Petscop. Additionally, model building of this kind is a highly challenging task, as there's only a very narrow opening from which one is able to maneuver. It seems to me that the ship in a bottle is a metaphor used to represent Petscop itself. The game has a limited set of assets, and of course, the game is also somewhat restrictive as it was built with 20-year-old technology, which has long since been outmoded. Back to the video. The player selects options and navigates down to the sound test. The effects range from things like the noise that plays when the Garolina logo is shown to the various noises that the so-called pets make. Or at least that's what's implied. The player doesn't try to play any of these sounds, they just keep scrolling. Footnote. Note also that a number of sound effects simply have question marks in their description. Does this mean that the designer never got around to giving these effects proper names, or does it simply indicate that the player hasn't yet experienced these sounds in the game? Based on the fact that they've been placed in a particular sequence, it would seem that the latter is the case. If it's true that the player hasn't yet experienced these sounds, it would seem that there's quite a bit of the game left to explore, which is both exciting and terrifying at the same time. Let's proceed. The player goes all the way to sound effect number 85. Care says, "Bye-bye." Then they navigate to sound effect 84. Care says, "Uh-oh." Footnote. This is the first time we have distinctively heard a person's voice in the game. Is this Care's actual voice? We know she's a real person in the universe of Petscop since, Paul alludes to her. For instance, he notes that he and Care have the exact same birthday. However, recall that Paul himself has never actually met Care.
Yeah, on that topic, I don't remember meeting this girl at all. I don't remember knowing her at any point.
We have no reason to believe that Paul would lie about this, so it stands to reason that he does not, in fact, remember Care. This fact alone may not seem strange, but I think you'll find as this video continues, it will be increasingly important to the series as a whole. Or at least I suspect as much. Let's continue. The player then enters an elaborate sequence of sound effects. Starting first with effect 85, this is played a number of times, and then sound effect 84 is played once. A little jingle plays and the screen turns red. A menu appears. It contains several options: all recordings, room impulse, and extra stuff. Footnote. It's clear to me that whoever is playing at this point has intimate access to certain developer capabilities within the game. It's worth asking how the player knows this information. We know Paul obtained access to the new Maker plane by entering a specific code, which was included on the note he found with the game itself. The player selects Room Impulse, and they are taken to another menu. There are a number of options available: Anna Office, Cellar, Sort Test, Gift Plane, Hallway 1, etc. The player scrolls down and selects an option called House. The player is then taken to yet another menu. In this one, there's only one parameter, an option called Gen, that can be set to a specific number. The player selects the number 10. They're taken to the house first seen in Petscop 11. Though in this particular state, it's clear that we are yet again witnessing Care's birthday party, an event previously seen in Petscop 14. It seems as though the player is able to scroll through various settings. A clicking noise can be heard as new iterations of the sprite appear on the screen. These new iterations have a red triangle over the face, a state we've previously observed way back in Petscop 12. As the player moves, so too do these various iterations move. However, it's important to point out that their movements appear to be entirely independent from one another's. Footnote. Let me just take a minute to explain what I think is going on here. It appears to me that a number of generations were created over the course of the game's development. Remember, Petscop is an unfinished game, or as the developer calls it, a growing organism. And since, as was made apparent in an earlier video, the game records all of the player's inputs, the precise movements of everyone who has ever played Petscop is available to view, provided that one has access to the series of codes required to enable certain developer capabilities. The so-called Room Impulse is a particular way of accessing all of these various gameplay sessions within a given generation, or at least that's what I think is going on here. Let's keep watching and see what happens. The player continues to scroll through all these various iterations of gameplay. They mess around in the house for a while, and then take a step outside. A message appears on the screen. Hi there, wake up, you're free. And then, strangely, the player begins walking backwards. There you go, thank you. The player walks backwards down the road. The message continues. I want you to retrace your steps. The family, as usual, wants to learn what happened to you between November 10th and 12th of 1997. The player reaches the end of the road and begins moving backwards into the green field. On November 10th of 1997, you ran away from your daddy's school building, and on the 12th, you arrived at your house. The question is, where were you on November 11th, and what were you doing there? I hope to guide you to that location with a spell, which I will begin now. The color of the text changes to yellow. You are a girl named Carrie Mark, and you were born on November 12th, 1992. Footnote. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Carrie Mark is the character referred to continually as Care throughout the series. Now, right as this player left the house, a text box appeared telling them that they were free. This would seem to indicate that the player was trapped inside the house. In some iterations of gameplay, we can in fact see the player attempt to leave the house. They're blocked from doing so right up until they're suddenly able to just walk out. There's no telling how long they've been wandering around in that house. Let's think about this in broader terms. Remember that we're still in the Room Impulse mode. So it would seem that a third-party observer has been attempting to find a session in which the player was able to leave the house. And it looks like they found just what they were looking for. Back to the video. You have a mommy named Anna, a daddy named Marvin, an auntie named Jill, an uncle named Thomas, a cousin named Daniel. The text changes back to white. I know what you must be thinking. Have these statements always been true? Or have I cursed you? Is there such a thing? A curse that changes your past? Stop thinking. The text then changes back to yellow. You were kidnapped and spent 5 months studying in an abandoned elementary school. You ran away crying, ashamed, covering your face. You were blind. At some point, your movements stopped making sense. The words "at some point" are in white. And then the text changes back to white. Bumping into walls and doors, dodging invisible obstacles. Find the moment. When were you led astray on the road? Footnote. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. This is what you might call an exposition dump. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. We really haven't had much in the way of direct exposition in the series thus far. But importantly, the significance of the information presented is not entirely spelled out for us. Nothing is spoon-fed to the audience when it comes to Petscop. So I just want to note a few things. Note that Marvin held Care captive in an abandoned school building. It's fairly clear that this is the school previously alluded to throughout the series. I just want to point out that the game itself alludes to an institution being abandoned. In the very first video, Paul happens upon a sign in Even Care which reads, "The gift plane has closed indefinitely, and all personnel have left." So there seems to be a thematic connection between the gift plane and the abandoned school building. All right, let's continue. We get a brief cut to black, and then we return to the previous scene. The player is still moving backwards. Another text box appears. "A girl went missing around here." The player stops dead in their tracks. In response to the message, they begin moving a bit in the opposite direction. Story goes, your daddy used to sit on a bench with a birthday cake, trying to lure her home. Instead of missing girl signs, he put up birthday girl signs, promising cake to the birthday. The text gets cut off here by the compass in the lower left-hand corner. Of course, the birthday girl never came home, to his disappointment. When I learned about this absurd story, I spent a lot of time digging. Eventually, I found out what really happened to that girl. Want to know? Ask. The message ends and the player begins moving in an elaborate pattern. The player is prompted to ask a question. The player asks, what happened to her? An object begins to rise from the ground. Eventually, we can discern that the object is, in fact, a tombstone. It reads, Lena Leskowitz, 1968 to 1977. They didn't see her. Footnote. That's a dead kid. So there is a tendency for this game to give brief, enigmatic descriptions whenever a tombstone is presented. Recall the description on Michael Hammond's grave in the second video. Mike was a gift. Note that if these graves are accurately labeled, Lena was 9 years old at the time of her death, while Michael was 7. Now, it would seem that the aforementioned story is in reference to this deceased child, Lena Leskowitz. Importantly, the Petscop YouTube channel was first discovered when a Reddit user named P.A. Leskowitz called attention to it on Reddit. This would seem to suggest that Paul's last name is, in fact, Leskowitz, meaning, of course, that he is related in some way to Lena Leskowitz. Further recall that in Petscop 9, Paul comes across a note from Rainer. Rainer says, I found that picture of you from 1977 standing in front of an old windmill with your friend. And as this tombstone indicates, Lena died in 1977. So it stands to reason that Rainer is referring to the incident that led to Lena's death. Recall that Rainer says, you went there, and it was a bad idea. Your friend and the windmill both disappeared into thin air. And then he says, you married her sister, and years later, your friend was reborn as your daughter. So, in this case, the concept of rebirthing, so to speak, is being used specifically in reference to Lena. Now, the consensus in the Petscop community seems to be that this letter was addressed to Marvin. If this is the case, it would seem that Rainer is suggesting that Lena was reborn as Care. Back to the video. The player ruminates on the disturbing scene, and then we get another cut to black. When we return, the player walks downstairs and heads directly to the tunnel. Cars come rushing out, but as always, they never hit the player. The player tests this mechanic a bit and then heads into the tunnel itself. Note that the player is still walking backwards at this point. That does it for Petscop 17. As with video 17, the 18th video was also made public on April 20th, 2019. It is 2 minutes and 29 seconds long. We return to the menu screen in the previous video. The player is idle for about 10 seconds and then selects Extra Stuff. Note that when the player selects Extra Stuff, the cursor turns into a pink dresser. The very first item in this portion of the game appears to be a design schema depicting various iterations of Paul's avatar, the main sprite in the game. Its label, 01 Guardian History. Footnote: it's only now in the 18th installment of the Petscop series that we get an actual name for this character, Guardian. There are some rather heavy thematic implications here. For now, I'd just like to point out that guardianship is a legal conceit. A guardian is someone who has legal authority to care for the interests of another person. One can have legal guardianship over another person in a number of situations. For instance, one might be appointed the legal guardian of an incapacitated senior due to old age or infirmity. Or, as is the implication in this series, one can be appointed guardianship over a minor if, for whatever reason, it has been determined that the minor's parents cannot serve that function. This is the role the player assumes when they obtain one of these so-called pets. Let's proceed. The second item appears to depict the evolution of the pet known as Amber. The third depicts Randus, the fourth depicts Toneth, the fifth depicts Pen, and the sixth depicts a character we haven't seen before, Hudson. Footnote: get a load of this guy. Yikes. I do find it interesting that the work is constantly alluding to all sorts of content we haven't experienced yet in the game. Recall all the sound effects we have yet to hear. It's almost as though there's a whole unseen world of curiosity and horror yet to be seen. I'm not really sure if that's the case or if the work is merely suggesting the possibility of a broader world. I tend to lean towards the latter. The player moves on to the next pet, Wavy, and then we're treated to a sparse-looking map of the gift plane and a nondescript rendering of the house. Footnote: note that the house moves slightly after a disquieting amount of time, and then it moves again right towards the end of the video. What do we make of these subtle movements? That does it for Petscop 18. Let's move on to the next video. Petscop 19 is 7 minutes and 45 seconds long. As with the other videos, it went public on April 21st, 2019. We find ourselves back at the menu accessed initially in Petscop 17. The player selects all recordings. They're taken to a rather extensive list of what we can assume to be recordings of prior gameplay. Footnote: is it really true that Petscop records all of the player's gameplay? Recall the ominous message given to Paul in Petscop 13. Your controller inputs will be useful, but your feedback will be even more useful. It's almost as though that message were intended for someone testing the game. Let me just take a quick second to describe what we're seeing here. There's a spinning icon next to each item. It appears to be a PlayStation memory card. Each entry has a gen number next to it. The first item is labeled Family 3, and it's from Gen 15. The lower two appear to have labels that were automatically generated, hence the prefix auto. Apparently, they're both from Gen 14. The player selects the third item and is given some additional options. The player has the ability to adjust the gen number, as well as a setting called Demo Rote. Footnote: recall that previously we have observed a flashing demo sign in the top center of the screen on various clips of gameplay footage. In the last batch of videos, it was revealed that Paul figured out a way to utilize demo sequences in order to continue making progress in the game. So, what is this setting Demo Rote? One relevant bit of context here is that this setting can either be on or off. It's possible that Rote stands for rotation, in which case, I take this to mean that the player can choose whether or not a given sequence is in the rotation, so to speak. If the demo rotation setting is turned on for a given sequence, that means it will eventually play via the game's demo mode, presumably when the game is left idle for a certain amount of time. If this is true, it means that the demos we've seen previously are, in fact, sequences stored in this here recording menu. They're from previous gameplay sessions. So, how is Paul able to use demo sequences to continue making progress in the game? Well, recall the events of Petscop 14. Towards the middle of the video, Paul was attempting to move a bucket through a closed door. Obviously, he wasn't able to get through the door in his original session. However, he noted that once his session was recorded and replayed via the game's demo mode, occasionally things in the game would be a little different. In this case, the door was open in the demo sequence, so Paul was able to get through it. How is it that conditions differ in the demo sequences as compared to the original session? In hindsight, it's relatively simple. The game was replaying Paul's sequence in a different generation, one in which the door was open. Back to the video. The player fiddles with the settings a bit and then goes back to the previous menu. They begin scrolling down past a number of recordings that have been automatically labeled. The further down the player scrolls, the lower the generation of gameplay sequences. The player gets to a batch of recordings from Gen 1, and then we see a number of recordings that have been individually labeled. There's one called Family 2 from Gen 15. There's one with a somewhat ominous label, Fuck 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 from Gen 14. And there's one called Tiara from Gen 13. The player continues scrolling down, first past a number of sequences that have been automatically labeled, and then we get to some videos that have been individually labeled. First, we're shown sequences with the name Bell 4 and Family. Keep in mind that we have previously seen Family 3 and Family 2. With this in mind, it stands to reason that Family is the first in this sequence of recordings. Then we're shown Marvin, a name that we all certainly remember at this point. Marvin's name appears in a Gen 6 sequence. Then, the player scrolls past a number of sequences that appear to be named after certain individuals, most of whom we aren't familiar with. There's Will, Wells, Trevor, Tony, Theo. The list goes on, and these names all appear in Gen 5 sequences. As was the case with the family sequences, some of these entries have a number next to the name, which would seem to imply that they are continuations of previous sequences. The player continues scrolling down. The very first recording is called Sort Test. It's from Gen 1. The player selects this recording and plays the sequence. Now, this appears to be a relatively minimal setup. The background is completely white. The Guardian appears in what I'll now refer to as its disheveled state. To the left, there are a number of boxes with arrows on them. As the player navigates through these boxes, it's clear that the sprite is not animated. It's just a static figure. The player works their way to the left and then begins some kind of procedure, making a point to go through each individual box. The player then selects another sequence. This one's labeled Mic 2. A loading screen appears. It's one that we haven't seen before. Again, we happen upon the Guardian in its disheveled state. The player's name as well as the gen number appear in the upper left-hand corner. The game as it existed in this particular state is still fairly rudimentary. The player is able to walk through walls. They navigate to a room in the gift plane, the very same one in which Randus and Wavy appear in later iterations. And wouldn't you know it, the player happens upon an Easter egg. The player catches an egg as one would with a pet in later generations, and a text box appears. What? One of the eggs was in Daniel's game? Footnote. Based on this, we can possibly infer that a real-life Easter egg hunt has taken place, and one last egg was hidden in the game itself. More importantly, this message refers to Petscop as, quote-unquote, Daniel's game. In all likelihood, this is the same Daniel mentioned in Petscop 17. Recall that a text box relayed the following information. You are a girl named Carrie Mark, and you were born on November 12th, 1992. You have a mommy named Anna, a daddy named Marvin, an auntie named Jill, an uncle named Thomas, a cousin named Daniel. Now in Petscop 19, we have an instance in which Daniel is implied to possess the game itself. So here's what I think is going on. All throughout the work, we've received messages from a person who refers to themselves as Rainer. And I've previously speculated that this so-called Rainer is the person who designed Petscop. I have also theorized that the name Rainer is a pseudonym, a name that the designer made up for some reason. Maybe they needed to operate under the guise of an anonymous moniker, or maybe they just think the name Rainer is cool. Who knows? But the major takeaway here is that I believe Rainer is Daniel, the cousin mentioned in this aforementioned line. If that's the case, I think it's fair to say that Daniel is the person who created Petscop, or at the very least played a major role in its development. The player moves around a bit, and another text box appears. What an unfair trick. Have you found every egg in the office? The player traverses to a white space and briefly goes left and right in short intervals, as if to say no to some unknown observer. Footnote. Sorry to interrupt again, but there's another important point I want to discuss. The text box here alludes to an office. This may well be the office in which Petscop was initially developed. If this is indeed the case, it would seem that a holiday party is taking place, an Easter party, and it is perhaps also true that the children of the various employees at Garolina are the ones taking part in this Easter egg hunt. But what is this unfair trick that is mentioned here? Well, an Easter egg hunt is premised on the idea that one is hunting for literal eggs. However, in this case, a virtual egg is hidden within the game. A conceptual leap is required to recognize this. Provided that Rainer is the one who has coordinated this Easter egg hunt, it would seem that the unfair trick here is the first in a series of puzzles, all of which require similar conceptual leaps. Oh, and one more thing. Since we know that Mike is a tester, we can be sure that this particular session initially occurred prior to his death in 1995. However, the version of the game that Paul plays says copyright 1997, Garolina, 2 years after Mike's death. It is perhaps the case that Mike's death was, at least in part, the impetus for the development of the creepy portion of the game, i.e. the Newmaker plane, as well as the area below the Newmaker plane. The video cuts to another scene. The text in the upper left indicates that Care is playing in this particular session, and the state of the game as it appears in this sequence is Gen 3. The game appears to be considerably more developed in this session. Footnote. So, at some point between this sequence and the last, a number of very important elements have been added to the game. Obviously, Randus and Wavy are now in the room, so we know at the very least that these two pets have been added. The developer has removed the Easter egg from this portion of the game, and in its place, there's one of the so-called pieces. As I've noted in previous videos, the pieces act as something of an incentive for the player to continue playing. In addition, they function as a signal to the viewer that what Paul is experiencing is, in fact, new to him. The same can generally be said of the players in these various sequences. Another important component is the background image that scrolls across the screen. It contains a symbol that correlates to a certain area in the level below the Newmaker plane. Since Generation 3 is very clearly a major update in comparison to Gen 2, it is perhaps the case that the Newmaker plane, as well as the area that correlates with Randus and Wavy's room, have both been created at this point in the game's development. The player is yet again in the gift plane, and this time Randus and Wavy are in the room. But Care doesn't appear to be all that interested in catching these so-called pets. She just keeps moving to the left and right over and over again. The video cuts to another sequence. The text in the upper right-hand corner indicates that we're still in Gen 3, but this time, Belle is playing. And it seems that she's considerably more invested in the puzzle-solving aspect of the game. She immediately catches both Randus and Wavy. Belle reads Randus's description. Randus is a flower. He does need water, but not as much as he thinks. You shouldn't worry. If you are considering Randus, you should adopt Wavy as well. Wavy knows how to trick Randus. Belle then reads Wavy's description. Wavy is a cloud. He's afraid of everything. He is especially afraid of freezing. According to him, he is never the same person for more than a few seconds. Belle exits the menu and continues on her way. The video cuts to another sequence. This one is labeled James 2. This sequence is being played in Gen 4. James has a difficult time catching Amber. It seems he hasn't quite caught on to what he's supposed to do here. The video cuts to yet another sequence. This one is labeled Phil, and again, we're in Gen 4. Phil seems to be a bit confused. He's just standing there, and it's possible that he's stopped playing at this point. The video cuts to a sequence called Amber 2 from Gen 5. Curiously, this recording shows the player trapped behind the metal bars along with the pet known as Amber. The video cuts to a sequence labeled Belle 3 from Gen 5. Per usual, Belle is working her way through the gift plane. She catches the pet referred to as Pen. The caught sign pops up, though it is still partially covered by the keyboard. This is a good indication that this portion of the game is still under development. A text box appears. Congratulations, you caught every pet in Even Care, aside from Toneth, who isn't here yet. Footnote. If we're to believe this text box, it would seem that the player referred to as Belle is something of a maverick in terms of her puzzle-solving capabilities, because she was able to capture every single pet in Even Care, even Roneth, a feat that every other player in this video was unable to do. Note that Paul himself was not able to capture Roneth until much later in the game. And that's where Petscop 19 ends. Let's move on to the 20th video. The 20th video is 18 minutes and 15 seconds long, so strap in. The player selects a sequence called Marvin. The gen is set to 6. Note that there's a fun little message in the pause menu. There is so much to discover in the world of Petscop. Boy, that's an understatement. The sequence begins. The Garolino logo appears. Notably, it's pointed diagonally as opposed to vertically like we've previously observed. The player, presumably Marvin, selects an empty slot and enters the letters NVM. Footnote. So, it's not entirely clear what NVM actually means in this context, but one of the more obvious inferences here is that MVM is Marvin's initials. After all, we know from Petscop 17 that his last name is Mark. Marvin starts his journey in the gift plane just like Paul in the very first video. The video abruptly cuts ahead to Marvin navigating his way through Even Care. It cuts yet again, and we happen upon Marvin working his way through the room with Roneth in it. After a bit of hesitation, Marvin navigates the controller menu and sees that left and right have been swapped around on the directional pad. A sound effect plays repeatedly so as to suggest that Marvin is attempting to reconfigure the controller buttons, but the game will not allow him to do so. He exits the menu and proceeds to scroll down. Another sound effect plays as the music suddenly stops. Footnote. I think we all know what's happening here, but for the sake of clarity, let me just spell it out. Apparently, Marvin has access to the very same code that allowed Paul to enter the so-called New Maker plane. Recall, in the very first Petscop video, Paul mentioned a note he found with the game itself. The note said, "For you."
Because the note, remember the note that came with this game, it said, "For you." It seems like it's possible. This game was made for, well, this part of the game was made for somebody to see.
With this in mind, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the note was originally intended for Marvin. Let's proceed. Marvin navigates to the entrance of Even Care. A loading screen depicts what appears to be a darkened version of Even Care with some kind of revolving door. Marvin is transported to the New Maker plane. He wanders around for a while. The video cuts to what we can presume to be a later point in time. Note that we're still watching a new sequence at this point. It has yet another automatically generated label. Marvin is still wandering. Again, the video cuts to another sequence. Still wandering. The video cuts again, and again, and again. We have no indication as to how long the player has been wandering at this point. The video cuts to black for a short period of time, and then a new sequence appears on the screen. Yet again, it's been auto-labeled, but this time the sequence is running in Gen 7 as opposed to Gen 6. The player is back at the entrance of the new Maker plane. A text box appears on the screen. Hi Marvin, Rainer here. You have to be careful this time. If you start running out there without a sense of purpose, you'll get lost. I'm writing this on July 10th, 1997, and Care is still missing. We are searching. Last weekend, we almost got lost ourselves. Your search is harder. Beyond here, there are no landmarks. But this model of a brick building, though crude, should still be familiar to you. Marvin examines the building. He peers around its right corner. Where is this building? Marvin peers around the left corner of the building. From here, I want you to find a grave. You know the grave I'm talking about. It's definitely out there somewhere. It's unmarked, of course. That's the trouble. You're the only person who can find it. Marvin begins exploring the area in a systematic fashion. Another message appears. I increased your speed so you can search faster. The video cuts to a new sequence. The text in the upper left indicates that it's from Gen 8. We happen upon Marvin back in the new Maker plane. However, this time he's near the entrance to the lower level. The door swings open and he heads down. A loading screen depicts a pack of crayons on a couch next to a throw pillow. Marvin heads down a flight of stairs and checks out a sign to the right. It says Roadmap. Marvin heads further to the right. He happens upon a series of 4 objects, each presented in the manner of things you might find in a museum or an art exhibit. There's another sign to the left of these objects. It says Caskets. When these are done, they will be great. Anybody who sees them is sure to become part of the family. Footnote. This message explicitly says that anyone who sees these items will become part of the family. This may be why certain items have been censored in the past. You know, we can't have all the family secrets getting out to just anyone, can we? The first in this series of caskets is a miniature chalkboard with something written on it. Unfortunately, the text isn't legible, as far as I can tell. Another message appears. This one is called Casket 4. 5 words, written on a chalkboard, in the dirty building that you inhabit. Marvin proceeds to the next casket. Initially, I didn't quite know what this was supposed to depict. At any rate, the following message should shed some light on the matter. This one is called Casket 3. After kicking you out of the house, your wife started painting the walls black to cover the stencils. I helped. She made it feel urgent. That Saturday, busy with work, she pinned a note. It contained a list of objects. Marvin moves on to the next casket. It's a red triangular object with what appears to be Care's face on it. Footnote. I should just point out here that this object is similar, if not identical, to the one we've seen previously. I'm speaking of the censored item from the gift box in Petscop 9. This one is called Casket 2. As I paint it, I watch Care dance around the house. Note that the name Care appears in yellow. She liked to spin. She became a blur. But in that blur, somehow, as she spun around, from 45 degrees to 90, 180 to 360 to 720, 1080, 1440, 1800, 2160, winding, tightening, I was stunned by pure horror and disgust. Marvin proceeds to the next casket. This one is called Casket 1. You showed Care her red, blurry reflection in a vase. You said, "Do you see that? Look how ugly you are." Note that the quoted text appears in green. Care squinted her eyes. The reflection wasn't clear at all, but as you began to describe her grisly deformities, she began to, quote-unquote, see them. "Nobody wants to see you like this," you said. But she soon escaped and bravely returned home. In her bathroom mirror, she saw a clear picture. Marvin goes to a new area on the right. He reads a sign that says, Places. He walks up to an image on the wall. It depicts a field with what appears to be a shadowy visage of a chalkboard. There's a wall behind the chalkboard, giving the impression that the space is enclosed. Marvin then navigates his way to a space that we should all be familiar with. He views the images of the house, the school, and the windmill. Footnote. So it would seem that Marvin's found himself in the same exact location we've previously seen Paul traverse multiple times. Except, something's a little different this time, isn't it? So let's take a step back. Way back in Petscop 8, Marvin appeared out of nowhere and led Paul down this same corridor. He walked into a wall to the left, right here where this passageway exists in Petscop 20.
I think you're confused, Marvin. I don't think you get what you're doing.
Note also that the bridge to the right isn't there in the sequence that plays in Petscop 20. Later on in Petscop 8, Paul has a conversation with someone, presumably via telephone. The person on the other end seems to allude to a passageway right in this exact area. Paul asks when they saw this passage and makes a suggestion.
Well, it could have changed between then and 2004. After 2004, my mom had it reportedly.
Let's proceed. The video cuts ahead. Marvin's checking out Michael Hammond's grave. Per usual, his tombstone reads as follows. Michael Hammond, 1988 to 1995. Mike was a gift. This time, the text lingers ominously on the screen, despite Marvin moving away from the vicinity of the grave. Is this a glitch, or is it something crafted especially for Marvin? The video cuts to another scene in which Marvin is asking the tool a question. Did you find Lena? He asks. The tool responds, I don't know. Marvin asks another question. Who is your boss? Again, the tool responds, I don't know. Marvin asks yet another question. This time, it's one that you might recognize. What year is it? A calendar appears on the screen, just as it did for Paul towards the end of Petscop 10. However, this calendar is green, whereas the previous calendar was red. Footnote, recall that we first see a green calendar in Petscop 11 back when Paul first happened upon the house. In that video, the dates on the calendar matched up with the year 1997. This would seem to suggest that Marvin's session is taking place in the year 1997. Back to the video. Marvin walks past the tool and looks outwards towards the windmill. Apparently, this generation of the game allows the player to navigate up and down in this portion of the game. Marvin directs himself upwards towards the sky, and then a few voices can be heard very low in the mix. Here, I've taken the liberty of increasing the volume. I can't really make out what they're saying, but listen to it for yourself.
And now, and what you look like, look like. See what this is. See what kind of things. See what you look like. Now, all that you look like.
Weird, right? Anyway, Marvin begins moving back downward towards the ground. Once he reaches the bottom, he rotates 180 degrees to find a white box with a symbol on it. It's the very same symbol that scrolls across the background in the tiny corner room back in Even Care. Marvin pauses and takes a quick look at his pet inventory. He only seems to have caught Tonith. At this point, the player pauses the sequences and exits the submenu. Note that for a brief moment, a message in the pause menu can be seen. It says, "Your butt leaves a cavity in the chair." The player navigates back to the sound effects and the video abruptly ends. Alright, let's move on to Petscop 21. As with the previous videos, Petscop 21 was released on Easter of this year. It's 3 minutes and 10 seconds long. There are just 2 words in the video description, the sign. Apparently, we are viewing yet another sequence from the recordings originally shown in Petscop 19. This one's labeled Care Dancing Sign, and it appears in Gen 8. The sequence depicts the player, presumably Care, making a series of elaborate movements towards the entrance to Even Care. Footnote. So, I obviously can't talk about this video without mentioning that this entire sequence is perfectly synced up to the song The Sign by Ace of Base. That's pretty cool, huh? So, Care is literally dancing to The Sign. Wait a minute. So, This is a song about a person who has been liberated from what she essentially describes as a toxic relationship. I wonder if that's supposed to mean something in reference to Petscop, especially since, it's Care that's dancing to this song. I saw the sign, it opened up my eyes, I saw the sign. With the chorus of this song being so, on the nose, I think it's worth considering that the lyrics relate in some way to the underlying themes of Petscop. In the last video of the investigation series, I talked a bit about how the work makes use of nostalgia, specifically that of the 90s, in order to elicit a certain effect. I think that's true on a number of levels when it comes to Petscop. So, the Ace of Base song fits with the general time frame in which this part of the series takes place. It totally makes sense why someone Care's age would be fond of that song at the time. But we're watching a recording of her controller inputs now, in 2019. So, in a sense, it's kind of like we're watching a ghost. Recall this line from the channel description. In a way, recordings have the power to raise the dead. It's creepy when you think about it that way. And it's kind of sad too, right? Because we have someone who is very clearly full of life and joy, and it is insinuated that she's been subject to some very elaborate form of brainwashing. Another thing to note here is that one of the signs does, in fact, play a significant role in establishing one of the major themes of Petscop, i.e. dehumanization. Recall that when Paul initially happened upon this sign on the left here, it read as follows. When you're choosing a pet, find somebody you like. You don't have to love them right away. In the very first installment of my investigation series, I noted the odd word choice here. Find somebody you like. It's a bit strange in a purely colloquial sense to ascribe personhood to a pet in this way. But here's the real kicker. In Petscop 9, Paul breezes through this level again, and this very same sign says something slightly different. It reads, when you're choosing a pet, find one that you like. Importantly, this takes place in the very same video in which Paul catches Care and subsequently transfers her to the so-called child library. The shift from somebody to one might seem trivial at first glance, but I've argued that this small detail is critically important to understanding this series as a whole. The speaker ascribes personhood to these so-called pets, and then takes it away. I don't know about you, but that seems like a really big deal to me. So that's why I have repeatedly emphasized it over the course of my investigation series. So I don't think it's a mere coincidence that Care performs her dance in this particular area. That wraps it up for Petscop 21. Let's move on to the new batch of videos starting with 22. Petscop 22 was published on September 1st, 2019. It's 25 minutes and 19 seconds long. The video description reads as follows. In a way, recordings have the power to raise the dead. They're kind of scary. This video kicks off with another sequence from the various recordings shown in Petscop 19. As with many of the previous sequences, this one has an automatically generated label. It's not entirely clear who's playing at this point, but as with the other sequences shown recently, this one's from Gen 8. The player asks the tool, "Where was the windmill?" And before we get a chance to see the response, a big black box appears, covering a significant portion of the screen. Yet again, an item has been censored from our view. The video cuts for a moment and returns right where it left off, and then we hear Paul's voice. Footnote. It's a function of the work to continually bring up this issue of temporality. When did this happen? When did this happen? What day is it? What year is it? We're absolutely supposed to be wondering about this sort of thing, so I want you to do something. Start thinking about time in relation to Petscop. It's thematically significant to the meaning of the entire series. So this is the first time we've heard Paul's voice in quite a while. Where's this guy been this whole time? Well, First off, it's important to keep in mind that we may not be viewing things in chronological order. There's no telling when exactly the previous sequences were recorded, and we can't be entirely sure when this here video was recorded either. But I do think it's worth a shot to try and piece together the timeline. So, with this in mind, I think it's worth mentioning that the beginning of this scene is oddly similar to the very end of Petscop 10, in which Paul asked the tool the very same question, where was the windmill? So I'm operating based on the assumption that Petscop 22 depicts events that occurred immediately subsequent to the events of Petscop 10. Back to the video. Apparently, Paul is talking to someone, but we're only able to hear his end of the conversation. Paul explains that he tried to ask the tool, where is the windmill, to no avail. Then he tried, where was the windmill, which produced some text along with a picture. Paul relays that he looked up the series of numbers that appears at the top of the screen, and he urges the person he's speaking with to do so as well. After a brief pause, the two speculate over their findings. They both seem to come to the same conclusion, and then Paul says, there's not a lot of detail, but it looks like a stone, right? Footnote. Alright, so what I'm getting from this is that Paul has come across a series of numbers that would appear to be coordinates. I would guess that he looked them up on Google Maps or something along those lines. And it would seem that Paul's friend has also looked up these coordinates and confirmed his suspicions. And these coordinates lead to an area with a large stone. Paul then expresses that he wants to go with his friend to a specific location. They agree to go the following Friday. Paul asserts that he's not going to show the family these findings until he's seen it for himself. He then assures the person he's talking to that he's not recording. Footnote. So, Paul just said he's not recording, and yet, here we are. So, what's going on? We know that Petscop 22 is a sequence from the series of recordings initially shown to us in Petscop 19. It appears at the 30-second mark. But who is recording Paul's voice? I will posit that one of two things is going on right now. Either Paul is lying, or he's being recorded without his knowledge. I really don't know which is more likely at this point. Either way, something seriously messed up is happening. There is some level of deception going on here. Let's proceed cautiously. Paul asks his friend what they make of the bottom numbers, and after a bit of back and forth, Paul wonders aloud about the possibility of approximating the size of a tile in the game in terms of real-world units of distance, such as feet or meters. He then speculates that if they were able to figure out exactly how far the staircase is from the windmill, they might be able to find something, presumably in real life. Paul acknowledges that the odds of his suggestion actually leading to something is unlikely, but he expresses excitement nonetheless, and he reaffirms his choice not to tell the family about this finding. Paul and his friend attempt to work out the logistics of their plan. Paul surmises that if they are able to find the stone and measure it, they can compare it to the windmill as it appears in the game. Additionally, they can measure their walking speed. Paul even suggests measuring the stone from the satellite image itself. Footnote. So Paul's goal here is to approximate an object in the game in terms of a real-world unit of distance. The idea is that they will be able to use real life to find things in the game. For instance, they might find certain landmarks near the stone in the real world, and subsequently they'll be able to track them down in the game instead of just wandering around aimlessly. Or at least that's my best guess as to what's happening. Then Paul says, they don't know much more than we do right now. Presumably he is referring to the family. He expresses discomfort with the idea of interacting with these people.
I don't like talking to them. They intimidate me.
Paul asks his friend if the family has attempted to contact them. Specifically, he wants to know if Jill has attempted to contact them. Footnote. Now, I certainly won't fault you for not remembering this, but this person named Jill was introduced way back in Petscop 14, a pivotal installment of the series. In the video, Paul triggered a strange encounter in the house, one which he suspected was based on a real conversation he had a year prior to that particular session. The speaker, whose dialogue appeared in yellow, seemed to be searching desperately for a disk, along with something they referred to as the discovery pages. In that same occurrence, Jill called the speaker Care and seemed insistent upon the fact that she, Jill, is the speaker's mother. This is rather confusing, as the information presented in Petscop 17 indicated that Jill is Care's aunt, not her mother. This is a glaring discrepancy. For now, let's just keep in mind that Jill is a person Paul seems to know in real life. And more to the point, she's a member of this so-called family. People who we've just been told intimidate Paul. Back to the video. Paul relays to his friend that he was questioned by Jill about the friend's existence due to the fact that he was talking to them in the very first series of Petscop videos.
Alright, so this is just to prove to you that I'm not lying about this game that I found. I'm just gonna walk you through everything that I've seen so far. And obviously it'll be exactly as I described it, because this is it.
Paul assures his friend that they don't have to worry about Jill following up with them, and the logic he employs here is very interesting, so pay attention.
Because you aren't family, so you wouldn't have a room. That's the thing.
Paul then clarifies that he didn't mean anything personal by saying that his friend is not quote-unquote family, strictly speaking. Footnote. The dynamic that Paul is somewhat awkwardly alluding to here has been spelled out in previous videos. Recall the various rooms in the so-called child library system. Each of these rooms corresponds to a particular facial pattern, and these facial patterns are correlated with particular characters in the game. Paul warns his friend that they won't be able to escape if Jill makes contact. It is unclear what exactly he means by this. Paul then implores his friend to help him. Specifically, he tells his friend that he needs their quote-unquote puzzle genius, after which he assures his friend that they are indeed a genius. Footnote. Sorry to interrupt again, but I just need to get this one out of the way. If you're beginning to suspect that the friend Paul is speaking with is indeed Belle, I just want you to know that I'm right there with you. There are a couple of points I want to go over to substantiate this claim. The first is that we have directly observed Belle's knack for puzzle solving. Recall that she breezed through even care with little to no difficulty. So Paul has just commended his friend for their puzzle solving abilities, and we know that Belle is stellar in that regard. Here's another piece of evidence that would seem to support the idea that Belle is the person Paul has been conversing with this whole time. In Petscop 12, it is relayed to Belle that her traits have not been added to the face system because she's not family. And as we've just heard from Paul himself, the friend he's talking to is not family, and therefore they do not have a room in the child library. So it's beginning to look like Paul's friend is, in actuality, this character referred to as Belle. Back to the video. Paul begins navigating away from the tool into the area known as Quitter's Room. He asks his friend if they were in the middle of something when he called and offers to stop the conversation. One gets the sense that Paul feels as though he is monopolizing his friend's time. After a short pause, Paul explains that he was under the impression that he would accomplish something by solving the cage puzzle. He also notes that the Tiara character is no longer in Quitter's room. Footnote. Let's just do a brief refresher on what Paul is talking about when it comes to this so-called cage puzzle. The concept of puzzles is something that recurs throughout Petscop. This is something I noted in the very first installment of my investigation way back in 2017. But as the series has progressed, the parameters of certain puzzles have systematically broadened over time. When Paul initially happened upon this room back in Even Care, the game required him to employ a certain kind of twisted logic in order to catch the pet known as Amber. After Amber jumped over to the right side of the room, Paul had to close the cage door on the left and very quickly walk into the enclosure. It would seem as though he locked himself inside. After this, Amber jumped back over to the left, allowing Paul to catch her. It would appear that Amber operated under the false assumption that no one was in the enclosure, and therefore she was safe. In other words, the implication here is that Paul had to deceive Amber in order to quote-unquote catch her. Paul is then able to exit the enclosure by walking to the right through an unseen passageway. This twisted logic takes on a life of its own in a later video. It's important to keep in mind that the game continually requires Paul to complete more and more complicated and abstract versions of the initially simple puzzles he solved in Evencare. It has been pretty well established at this point that the various elements of Evencare are strongly correlated with certain features in the area below the new maker plane. In Petscop 9, Paul used the treadmill in Evencare to trigger a mechanism down below, which enabled him to catch Care NLM. In Petscop 10, it is required of Paul to extend the thought process by which he previously caught Amber to another dimension entirely. It was required of Paul to manipulate the levers in Amber's room in order to enter the left side of Quitter's room. This essentially worked, but not without a major hiccup. Namely, Paul triggered a mechanism that closed the door in the Evencare hallway, which prevented him from going back to the new maker plane. But importantly, Paul figured out a clever workaround, or at least it seemed to be a workaround at the time. In actuality, the game required him to do this in order to continue making progress. So I guess we can't really call it a workaround, can we? Paul basically figured out that by intentionally crashing the game, he could make use of something called the panic save function. It's a fail-safe execution that saves the game in the event of a crash. Paul intentionally crashed the game with the understanding that the panic save function would save his progress. It's similar in a way to the method Paul used to exit the enclosure in Amber's room. He exited through an unseen passageway. In this case, the unseen passageway is relatively more abstract. He had to actually crash the game in order for it to work. Do you see what I mean? The game subjects the player to increasing levels of complexity and abstraction. So Paul gets access to the left side of Quitter's room, and we initially see that this character he refers to as Tiara is now on the right side, still mirroring his every move. And yet, in Petscop 22, curiously, Tiara isn't there anymore. Back to the video. After Paul mentions that Tiara is no longer in Quitter's room, there's a brief pause. And then he says, "What do you mean, of course?" It would seem that Paul's friend has a more thorough understanding of what has happened here than he does. There's another pause, and then Paul says, "Give me a second here to verify that logic." Footnote. I would be remiss not to point out that the clock in Quitter's room is obscured from our view for the vast majority of this video. However, there is one small portion of the video, really just a few frames, where we get a subtle glimpse of it. Its position? Why, it's funny you ask. I've taken the liberty of increasing the brightness and contrast of this video, and wouldn't you know it, it's the exact mirror image of the clock shown on the right side of the room in Petscop 12. Why is this significant? Well, see, it's quite possible that Paul has just freed Belle from Quitter's room. Recall that in Petscop 12, a text box was addressed to Belle telling her that she was free, after which a fun little jingle played. It's possible that these messages were left by Raynor, but the speaker does not identify themselves as such. The speaker then relayed that they left messages for Belle to look at in the event that she was rescued. This would seem to indicate that Belle was being held against her will in some fashion. In addition, the speaker told Belle that she had been running Petscop for 153,822 hours. That's about 17 and a half years for anyone keeping track. Keep in mind, the 12th video was uploaded in January of 2018. So if this information is accurate, it stands to reason that this particular gameplay session, i.e. Belle's, has been running since the year 2000. However, it's important to note that the speaker finds this information to be dubious. So, has Belle been stuck in Quitter's room this whole time? Has Paul unwittingly freed her from the confines thereof? It would appear that way. Now, why would Belle be locked inside Quitter's room? It's important to note that Belle is strongly associated with another name we've heard previously, Tiara. In Petscop 15, Marvin referred to this same character as Belle. However, she asserts that her name is Tiara, not Belle. Further, recall another important tidbit of information. This one is doled out in Petscop 12. In that video, the speaker asserts, "I'm calling you Belle because that's who you are. You might be confused as to what happened. I was overeager before and started calling you Tiara prematurely. I created a space in the menu for you, still unused now. Then I put you inside the machine and played the second movement of Stravinsky's Septet on the Needles. I played it wrong, but that would have been okay. If you hadn't given up halfway, you would be Tiara. This is not what happened, and now I'm gone." According to this, Belle gave up halfway through this mysterious rebirthing process. And because of this, her transformation into Tiara was disrupted. Subsequently, she became trapped in the area known as Quitter's Room. Now, if it is indeed true that Paul's friend is, in fact, this character referred to as Belle, we absolutely need to consider the implications of this. For now, let's just keep in mind that it is strongly implied that this person has been held in captivity, in Petscop, of course, and on top of that, they've been subject to some kind of weird process intended to make them think that they're another person entirely. If this is the person Paul has been speaking with this whole time, it would be an understatement to say that he doesn't even remotely know what he's gotten himself into. Let's move on. The video cuts forward, but it's clear that we're still viewing the same sequence. Some indiscernible noise can be heard in the background. Paul denies the accusation that he's in a car. As he's done previously, Paul heads down these here stairs, turns to the right, and subsequently becomes the so-called Shadow Monster Man. Paul claims that the noise heard previously was his front door. He is adamant that the noise was his front door. Paul heads down towards the road, and just as soon as he crosses, a car hits him, and his sprite disappears entirely. Paul exclaims, "What the fuck?" and begins explaining to his friend what happened. As he's talking, the perspective of the game slowly shifts upwards. Paul laments the fact that he's not recording. Sadly, he wasn't able to capture the incident. Suddenly, a figure comes from the right. It's the character previously referred to as both Tiara and Belle. She stands in the middle of the road, face forward. At this point, the person on the other end of the line seems to stop engaging with Paul. He asks if they're still there. Footnote. So, if you listen very closely to this part, well, here, listen for yourself.
Paul, you there?
Now, it sounds to me like Paul is saying, "Belle, you there?" If this is, in fact, what Paul is saying here, it would seem to confirm my sneaking suspicion that Belle is the person on the other end of the phone. Back to the video. Paul directs his inquiry to the character on the screen.
What are you doing there? Why are you just standing there?
The character's face inches ever so slightly to the right. This is not an ability we've seen previously. Paul asks if he's supposed to do something. The character sporadically shifts their face to the right. Paul says, "I know you're trying to say something to me. What do you want?" He then asks what over and over again, getting audibly more frustrated with each passing moment. The character begins facing rightwards and gesturing repeatedly to the right. We can then hear some noise as though Paul is perhaps shifting around in his chair. The video fades into a demo sequence, and the camera goes through the tunnel. A clock appears on the screen. It indicates that the time is 3 o'clock. The perspective shifts to a bench outside the school. The demo sign disappears, possibly indicating that we're viewing another session entirely. Triangle Head appears, and the character's appearance shifts to that of the regular old Guardian sprite. It's not clear at this point who is playing the game. There's a red circle in the corner. Footnote. Recall that we've previously seen this red circle in the lower left-hand corner. It first appeared in Petscop 16 in the upper right-hand corner. Subsequently, it appeared in Petscop 17 in the lower left-hand corner. I will assert here that as with the session shown in the 17th video, the game in this video is in Room Impulse mode, a developer capability that allows the user to access previous iterations of gameplay. The player walks into the school. A loading screen depicting Marvin's face appears. The player then begins navigating the school hallways. They walk up to a locker in the corner and fiddle with the combination lock. The video cuts to another point in the session. The player walks up to a flight of stairs. They are repeatedly sent back to the same place, facing an entryway with this character on the wall here. Eventually, the player enters this area. It's a bright room with a couple of chairs and a shelving unit on the wall here. A high-pitched noise can be heard in the distance. A text box appears. Hi there, sorry for pulling you out of class. I know you've been busy catching up. Don't worry, I just want to talk with you. Hey, do you want to play a game? You can pick any game you want, and we can play it together. Footnote. In this scene, it is strongly suggested that the player is interacting with a social worker or some kind of school counselor. The speaker's suggestion that they play a game is a dead giveaway here. This is a method commonly employed by counselors in order to make their subjects, children, feel more at ease, and thus more likely to open up and express any difficulties they might be having. The player is then given access to the games on the shelving unit here. It would appear as though they can choose which game they'd like to play. There's checkers, a game called accident, and another called rotation. Footnote. I'm not exactly sure what to make of this, but this interlocking box next to the word accident here has also appeared in another part of the game. It first appeared way back in Petscop 2, right outside the building in which the tool resides. You might not see anything upon first glance, but if you look closely, you'll see that there's a very faintly discernible series of shapes in the window. Here's that same window again in Petscop 12. Belle walked past it shortly after she was rescued from Quitter's room. So this is very clearly the same exact shape on the board game Accident. What does this mean? Well, the work might be implying that there is some kind of connection between this area of the game and a certain accident. Speaking of accidents, it's worth keeping in mind that the description on Lena's grave was somewhat ominous. It read, "They didn't see her." This might indicate that Lena was hit by a car. On top of that, keep in mind that Paul's sprite was just taken out by a car. Recall that this occurred after he transformed into the so-called Shadow Monster Man. So, by the logic of the game, the driver was not able to, quote-unquote, see him, because Paul was blending in with the darkness. There's a game on the top called Grave Robber. The player selects Grave Robber and another text box appears. Grave Robber is kind of like Battleship. Oh, you already know Grave Robber? That's good. I don't like explaining things. A board game appears on the screen. Footnote. Well, I do like explaining things. And since we don't know Grave Robber, I just like to note a few observations as we go. So importantly, the speaker has called attention to the similarities between this game and a real board game called Battleship. Battleship is a two-player game. The board is split into two halves, and importantly, each player is only able to see their side of the board. Typically, there's a little dividing wall that obscures the other player's side. Each player has a fleet of ships. The players position their ships on their side of the board, and only they know the position of these ships. And then the other player tries to guess the positions of these various ships, and once they've identified every position a ship occupies, they sink it. The point of the game is to take out the other player's entire fleet. Another important thing to note is that the players are typically able to record their guesses on the little dividing wall, which also serves as a kind of representation of the other player's board. Now, let's take a quick look at this here board. It's a checkerboard pattern. The top is gray and the bottom is green. The dimensions of the board are 16 by 8 squares. Each side has a total of 64 spaces. There are two pieces on the board. One is white and the other is red. And there's a big windmill on the board as well. The top panel indicates that player 2 is waiting for player 1 to make a move. The bottom panel directs the player to, quote-unquote, place your windmill. Back to the video. The player places the windmill in the upper left corner of their half of the board. The game then directs the player to place their first grave. A little grave appears on the screen and the player angles it to face right. The player then places the grave in the lower left-hand portion of the board. The game then directs the player to place their second grave. The player angles it to face down and places it in the upper right-hand corner of the board. The player is then directed to place their third grave. The player angles it to face left, and then they place it in the lower right-hand corner of the board. Footnote. With the similarities to Battleship called to mind here, Let's consider the possibility that Gravedigger is also a game in which the player must guess the coordinates of something. In this case, they have to figure out where their opponent has placed a number of so-called graves. Recall that Marvin was directed by Rainer to find a grave in Petscop 20. From here, I want you to find a grave. You know the grave I'm talking about. It's definitely out here somewhere. So there is very clearly some kind of connection here. It could be that this part of the game was specifically designed to obtain information from Marvin, perhaps the location of a certain someone. 3 options appear in the lower panel: continue, record, and another word that isn't visible due to the red circle covering it. The player selects record and a message appears on the panel. It reads, "What just happened?" The player then selects a number of spaces on the top portion of the board. The first is on the lower left and the second selection is on the top right. The player then selects continue and another set of options appear. The first is move and the second is dig. There are 2 more options, but again, they are not visible due to the red circle. The player selects move and the game indicates move up, down, left, or right. The game also highlights the spaces that are available to move to. The player moves their red piece to the space occupied by the 3rd grave. Then it would seem that player 1's turn is complete. Player 2 very quickly makes their move. They position the white piece next to the windmill. Another text box appears. "I called you several times, and you didn't come. Do I have the wrong name here? I notice you named your file Strange Situation. Is that your name? Please confirm." The player is then prompted to enter their name. They enter Paul, so it would seem that Paul is indeed playing right now. Another text box appears. "Paul. Okay. Your turn, Paul." The name Paul appears in red in each instance. Paul hits record and selects a number of spaces on the top row of the board. Paul then selects dig, after which a shovel appears in the lower half of the board. Paul selects the space right next to where the red piece is positioned and digs. A brown square appears right in the same position Paul dug on the top portion of the board. The top panel reads, "Player 2 reported that nothing was found here." Paul selects record again and selects a number of spaces on the bottom row. 1 square appears in red. It's the one in the same position as the red piece on the top portion of the board. Player 2 very quickly positions their white piece 2 spaces down from where they were previously. Again, Paul selects record. He highlights 2 spaces towards the left side of the board. He then proceeds to move his red piece up 3 spaces. Player 2 quickly moves their white piece 6 spaces to the right. Another text box appears. "Are you right-handed or left-handed?" "You don't know? Really? Well, which hand do you write with?" "That one? That's your left hand. That means you're left-handed. I'm right-handed. I use this hand. My right is actually your left. Isn't that confusing?" Footnote. Recall that all throughout the series, the game has alluded to the idea that Paul has trouble telling his left from his right. Anyway, your turn. Paul selects record. He highlights 6 spaces on the 3rd row of the board. He contemplates digging, but instead decides to make another move. Paul moves his red piece 4 spaces to the left. Player 2 immediately moves their white piece 3 spaces down. Paul highlights 3 spaces on the right side of the board. He then proceeds to dig in a space near the middle of the board. Again, the panel on the top says, "Player 2 reported that nothing was found here." Yet again, Player 2 has something to say. "Moving 5 times in a row was a mistake. Now I can't retrace all my steps." Footnote, recall that back in Petscop 20, Marvin was wandering around the Newmaker plane and it seems like he kind of got lost. Kind of seems like this player is making the same mistake here. Back to the video. You should dig often. It helps you win. Paul digs to the right and the top panel says, "Something was there, but what?" Player 2 moves their white piece 3 spaces up. In response, Paul moves all the way to the right. Player 2 moves quickly all the way to the left. Another text box appears. Kids shouldn't say swear words. Do you know why? It just doesn't sound right. It's disturbing. You should choose cleaner words, even when you're really angry. Your turn. Paul and his opponent exchange a few additional moves. Player 2 attempts to dig up, but as the bottom panel indicates, there was something in the way. yet another text box appears. That's a very big boo-boo on your face. We're going to help you. Together. Everyone is. When you reach for your shoes will be there. When you walk through a doorway, the door will be open. Wherever you go, the floor will continue under your feet. Every move you make will be made valid. Everything you see will become real. Everything you say will become the truth. Your turn. Paul hesitates for a moment and then selects an option obscured from our view. Looks like he's had enough of this game. You want to quit? Why? Oh, I don't blame you. Grave robbery is vile. This is an awful game, huh? We can play something else if you want. The screen goes back to the game selection menu. It's okay, you can go. I hope you can find your real house. Paul exits the game, looks around the office a bit, and then heads back into the school hallway. He goes down a flight of stairs and heads into a darkened area. The screen goes black for a moment, and then a darkened stairway appears. Ominous music begins playing. Paul heads down the stairs and to the left. Footnote. Of course, from the Guardian's perspective, he's turning to the right, down the stairs, and to the right. The screen begins shifting to the right towards the darkened area Paul has just entered. Darkness encompasses the entire screen, and the video ends. That wraps it up for Petscop 22. Let's move on to the next video. Petscop 23 was published on September 1st, 2019. It's 20 minutes and 19 seconds long. There's no video description for this one. The video opens with the Petscop title screen, but strangely, we don't hear the song that typically coincides with this. The player selects Start. A loading screen appears depicting the back of Marvin's head. The demo sign is still flashing. The game starts in the school hallways. The player turns a corner and walks up a flight of stairs. Only the sound of the character's footsteps is discernible. The screen cuts to the Garolina logo. Footnote. Unlike the previous times this logo has appeared, this one has a black background. Additionally, the text is facing upright, so we can clearly see what it says. Recall that we've seen this logo in a number of different positions at this point. I don't exactly know if this means anything, but considering the escalating series of events that have taken place at this point, it seems significant to me that the Garolina logo is finally in its upright position. The player continues up the stairs. The G from the Garolina logo can be seen as the player turns a corner. They look around. There's a rug with a letter block pattern. There's a series of pieces formed into a Christmas tree on the right side here. It's spinning. The player walks up to it. In addition, there are a number of computers in the room. They're remarkably similar to the Tarnikop computer back in the garage. A television is visible in the back. It has the words Petscop Kids on it. The player goes back to the Christmas tree and uses their little tool thingy to collect the pieces. At this point, they've collected a total of 500 pieces. The music stops. The whole room gets dark. The only source of light in the room is the television screen. The player looks around. They walk into a classroom. Something's written on the chalkboard here, but it's too small to read. When the player zooms in on the chalkboard, the writing gets censored. Marvin appears and addresses the player as Paul. Marvin asks him, "What room are you in?" Paul takes a gander at the red box on the right here. It has the number 8 above it. The box depicts a room with a bed, a television, a chair, and some kind of device in the upper right-hand corner. Paul looks at the next box, number 7. The room has the exact same contents, but it's arranged in a different manner. The same goes for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Footnote. All right, I won't fault you for missing this, but there's a very important frame in this portion of the video. One single frame. Take a look for yourselves. I've taken the liberty of increasing the contrast and brightness. It's a message. It says, push bed against hidden door, and then there's an arrow pointing down. Recall that Bell has previously demonstrated the ability to write on walls via a certain developer capability. Pretty, shall we say, nifty, eh? So It makes sense to me that Belle is, in fact, the person who left this message. Back to the video. Paul indicates to Marvin that his room is number 1. Marvin says, "Thanks," and then, "Here I come." Paul says, "What? No. No." Paul then attempts to communicate something else, but he stops in the middle of a word. Nothing happens for a long while. The screen cuts to black, indicating that some time has passed. Marvin leaves the classroom. The words "not in table" appear above the Guardian, indicating that the game does not recognize the controller inputs given here. The player, who has previously been referred to as Belle, comes in. She says, "I'm sorry." Paul says, "Help." Belle approaches the chalkboard and Paul follows her. Belle writes something on the chalkboard. It says 9-2-19. Paul leaves the classroom with Belle. Paul navigates through the hallway and approaches the locker. He enters the numbers given by Belle, 9-2-19. The locker opens. Its contents? An Easter egg and a letter. The letter is titled "Your New Life Letter." Paul reads it. Your name, Tiara Leskowitz. Your message. You are off to school today. I will miss you. I love you so much. I miss you so much when you are off to school for the day. I will be waiting for you when you get home. I will be on a lawn chair in the driveway, waiting for the bus to drop you off. Every day I am so happy to see you come home and tell me what you learned. I hope everybody treats you with love and respect. Love you forever, no matter what. Mommy. Footnote. So, if we're to believe this letter, it would seem to confirm that the character referred to as Tiara is, in fact, a Leskowitz, meaning, of course, that she's related to Lena and most likely Paul as well. But who wrote this letter? We don't have a whole lot to go on. Recall the letter shown to us back in Petscop 11. My husband may come here after 6 p.m. Please stay overnight if you can. Thank you so much. Importantly, this letter had a little black symbol at the bottom. If we're to believe the message addressed to Care in Petscop 17, Anna Mark is her mother. Therefore, Anna is most likely the person who wrote this one. If we assume that the symbol is meant to be some kind of identifier, it is telling that the letter from the locker lacks the same identifier. So at the very least, we can surmise that these letters are most likely not written by the same person. This one was likely written by a Leskowitz as opposed to a Mark. Now, let's talk about the contents of the letter itself. At face value, this is a letter from an extremely supportive mother. Perhaps even a little too supportive, if you catch my drift. I'm getting some indications that the person who wrote this letter is perhaps in a manic state. Let's also keep in mind that this letter is called Your New Life Letter. Was this letter meant for Belle after her transformation into Tiara? After she assumed a new life, so to speak? Let's proceed. Paul engages the tool multiple times. The letter disappears and Paul closes the locker. Again, Paul walks into the darkness and down the flight of stairs. This time he goes through the door straight ahead. He walks into a darkened room. There's a pack of crayons on the ground as well as a sign. It says, "You'll find the machine up ahead." Footnote. So what exactly is this machine being referenced here? In Petscop 7, the tool turned pink for a moment and Paul asked it some questions. Tool relayed that Marvin wanted 1,000 pieces for the machine beyond the school basement stairway. Also, recall in Petscop 12 the scene in which Belle is told, "I was overeager before and started calling you Tiara prematurely." Then the speaker relays that they created a space for her in the menu. The speaker continues, "Then I put you inside the machine and played the second movement of Stravinsky's septet on the needles. I played it wrong, but that would have been okay. If you hadn't given up halfway, you would be Tiara. This is not what happened, and now I'm gone." So, assuming that this is the same machine that was referenced by the tool, it would seem that this thing plays an essential role in the rebirthing process that Marvin wishes to initiate. Back to the video. Paul continues reading the sign. "This is the only entry or exit. You will pass through this room again as you leave. Keep in mind, Everything here your baby will see. Paul moves the pack of crayons over to the right. Then he moves a little pack of Play-Doh. After this, he moves what appears to be a little desk into the pit in the center of the room. There's a photo of a child in the corner. Paul pushes it around. He proceeds to push the pack of crayons into the pit. Then he pushes the photo of the child into the pit. The camera angle shifts to the door in the bottom left corner. The door opens. Paul enters. There's a figure off to his right. He turns and walks towards it. The word caught appears on the screen and a familiar little jingle plays. Paul navigates to his pet inventory and selects Care B. Her description reads as follows. Care B is scared and pounding on the door. I open it. It's so dark that I can't see her, so I pull her out and the light hits her face, and they won't even give me a picture of her now. They're all scattered in graves. And I'm a piece of shit. Here I go. A shovel slides across the screen. Paul walks up to the pit and looks down. He then proceeds through the door, straight across from the pit. He enters a checkerboard room with an ominous red glow to it. Marvin stands directly in front of him. Belle stands to the left of Marvin. Paul goes to the right. The screen darkens and the number of pieces Paul has collected over the course of the game begins to dwindle. Paul stands to the right of Marvin. They form a triangle. Marvin says, "Put baby." Paul navigates to his pet inventory and selects Care B. A text box appears. It says, "Spin when ready." Paul places Care B into the turnstile and engages the mechanism. Marvin says, "Time to play." Paul is prompted to play the so-called Needles piano. He plays a series of notes. Marvin says, "Fuck, stop." He moves towards Paul. Paul continues playing. Marvin seems to panic, and then he leaves the room. Paul engages the turnstile again and obtains an orange and yellow Easter egg. He navigates to his pet inventory and reads the egg's description. Strangely, it starts with a question mark. Then it reads, "You should start thinking about that." Footnote: this same phrase appeared in the very first Petscop video, specifically in reference to the pet known as Amber. What's the safest place you can put her in? You should start thinking about that. So this could be an indication to the player that they need to find a safe place to store this egg. Back to the video. Paul exits the pause menu and leaves the basement. He walks back to the locker, enters the combination he obtained from Belle, and subsequently, he places his new egg into the locker. The game is completely silent. Paul exits the school and walks in front of the bench. For a moment, the screen flashes a pale bluish color, and a new screen appears. It's the garage from the house, except this time the door is opened, allowing daylight to illuminate the area. The start menu appears, and then the video abruptly ends. Let's move on to Petscop 24, the final video in this latest batch. As with the prior videos in this batch, Petscop 24 was published on September 1st, 2019. It's only 3 minutes and 21 seconds long. Strangely, the video description says "now" with a colon next to it. The screen is black. Unlike the previous video, the demo sign is not flashing. The player hits pause, and that same pale blue image of the new maker plane minimizes as the pause menu appears. The player selects Book of Baby Names. Footnote: in Petscop 6, Paul mentioned that he had previously tried to select this option, but nothing happened. He speculated that it allowed players to name their pets. It seems that now we will see what Book of Baby Names actually means. A pink screen appears and the words Petscop Kids crawl up across the screen. A rhythmic song begins to play. A series of names appear. They're arranged in alphabetical order. Each name is matched with a brief description. For instance, Amber is associated with the description Angel. There are a few other immediately recognizable names as well. Belle's name is associated with the word Smart. Carrie's name is associated with Dizzy, and Mike is associated with the word Painter. The list ends with the words, "Thanks for testing." Footnote: so, a few of these names are familiar, but what about all these other so-called Petscop kids? Well, as these final words of gratitude suggest, it seems that these are the names of all the kids that tested Petscop. Each of these names appeared in Petscop 19 when the player was scrolling through the recordings. It would appear as though the developers of Petscop created a special way to say thank you to everyone who helped them out with the game. But what does this mean in relation to the work itself? Well, I wouldn't fault you for thinking that this is the final video in the entire series. Given the nature of this video, i.e., the manner in which it appears like an end credits sequence, it seems like a fairly natural conclusion. I myself will refrain from this line of speculation, as I've been proven wrong on this issue more than a few times. Back to the video. Some additional text appears, and now a message from Mrs. Mark, who is working very hard as we speak. The words Mrs. Mark appear in purple, along with some subsequent text. Hi, Michael. Consider this your birthday card. Sorry I can't put money in it. When I heard how many kids were coming to your party, I was impressed. Thank your big brother for letting you and your friends play games all day and making you so popular. Also, thank your other auntie for making this all possible. If you see her, I mean. Not everyone can. But anyway, happy 7th. I'm so sorry I couldn't be here. I hope my gift makes up for it. It's the one in the black box. Carrie helped pick it out. Thank her. Opening gifts is so fun. A lot of little mysteries, and all are solved. So, quote-unquote, cathartic. Anyway, I sure hope you have fun. See you later. Love you. Auntie Anna. P.S. Whatever you do, please don't shake the box. A symbol appears. It looks like a flower. And, well, that wraps it up for Petscop 24. That's it, folks. So, I've gone over a total of 8 Petscop videos in this installment of the Investigation series. And I have to say, I'm kind of winded. That was quite a bit of material. And you know what? I'm also kind of ambivalent. For the sake of transparency, I'm going to tell you what's going through my mind right now. I feel like I've made some progress in the way of understanding these recent events in the Petscop universe, but I'm still scratching my head over a number of elements. And I'm still looking for the bigger picture, so to speak, with respect to the significance of these events. As I was evaluating the scope of Part 7, I basically came to the conclusion that another video would be required in order to give an overview of the series as a whole. So that's currently in the works. And for now, I'll just say this. Happy Halloween, folks! That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Again, if you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, you can support me for as little as $1 a month on patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. All patrons get early access to my podcast, Nightmare Tonight, as well as access to premium episodes and other goodies. Thank you for watching, and good night.